This is the fourth part of our reading of Plato's Timaeus, translated by Thomas Taylor. We continue with the speech of Timaeus. But concerning voice and hearing, we again assert that they were bestowed on us by the gods on the same account. For the acquisition of speech pertains to these, and is of the greatest advantage to their possession. And whatever utility musical voice brings to the sense of hearing was bestowed for the sake of harmony. But harmony, possessing motions allied to the revolutions of our soul, is useful to the man who employs the muses in conjunction with intellect, but is of no advantage to irrational pleasure, though it appears to be so at present. Indeed, it was given us by the muses for the purpose of reducing the dissonant circulation of the soul to an order and symphony accommodated to its nature. Rhythm, too, was bestowed on us for this purpose, that we might properly harmonize that habit in our nature, which for the most part is void of measure and indigent of the graces. And thus far, a few particulars excepted, have we shown the fabrications of intellect. But it is likewise requisite to give a place in our discourse to the productions of necessity. For the generation of the world, being mingled, it was produced from the composition of intellect and necessity. But intellect, ruling over necessity, persuaded it to lead the most part of generated natures to that which is best. And hence, necessity, being vanquished by wise persuasion, from these two, as principles, the world arose. If, then, anyone truly asserts that the universe was generated according to these, he should also mingle with it the form of an erratic cause, which it is naturally adapted to receive. In this manner, then, let us return, and, assuming a convenient principle of these, again discourse concerning them as about the former particulars, commencing our discussion from their origin. Let us therefore speculate the nature and passions of fire and water, air and earth, prior to the generation of the heavens. No one, indeed, as yet has unfolded the generation of these. But we speak of fire and the other elements as if the nature of each was known, and place them as the principles of the universe, when at the same time they ought not to be assimilated to elements, not even as in the rank of syllables, by men who in the smallest degree merit the appellation of wise. But now we shall not speak of the principle or principles, or whatever other denomination they may receive, of all things, and this for no other reason than the difficulty of delivering what appears to be the truth about these in the present mode of disputation. Neither, therefore, is it proper that you should expect me to speak, nor that I should persuade myself into a belief of being able to speak with perfect rectitude on so difficult a subject. But it is proper, as I told you in the beginning of this discourse, that preserving all the force of assimilative reasons, we should endeavor to deliver that which is not less assimilative of the truth than the doctrine of others, and that in this manner we should discourse from the beginning concerning particulars and the whole. In the first place, therefore, invoking the divinity, who is the Savior of discourse, and beseeching him to lead us from an absurd and unusual exposition to an assimilative doctrine, we shall again begin to speak. But it is necessary that the beginning of our present disputation should receive a more ample division than the former one, for then we made a distribution into two species. But now a third sort must be added. In the former disputation, two species were sufficient, one of which was established as the form of an exemplar, intelligible and always subsisting according to same. But the other was nothing more than the imitation of the paradigm, generated and visible. But we did not then distribute a third, because we considered these two as sufficient. However, now reason seems to urge us as a thing necessary that we should endeavor to render apparent by our discourse the species which subsists as difficult and obscure. What apprehension, then, can we form of its power and nature? Shall we say that it is an eminent degree the receptacle and, as it were, the nurse of all generation? Such an assertion will indeed be true, but it is requisite to speak more clearly concerning it. And this will certainly be an arduous undertaking on many accounts, but principally because it will be necessary to doubt, previous to its discussion concerning fire and the rest of the elements, why any one of these should be called water rather than fire, or air rather than earth, or why any one should be denominated some definite particular rather than all. For it is indeed difficult to frame any certain opinion, or to employ any stable discourse about such intricate forms. After what manner then, and in what respect, and what of an assimilative nature shall we assert in this dubious inquiry? In the first place, then, that which we now denominate water, when it loses its fluidity by concretion, appears to become stones and earth. But when liquefied and dispersed, it forms vapor and air. Likewise, air, when burnt up, becomes fire. And on the contrary, fire, becoming concrete and extinct, passes again into the form of air. And again, air, becoming collected and condensed, produces mists and clouds. But from these, still more compressed rain descends. And from water, again, earth and stones derive their subsistence. And thus, as it appears, they mutually confer on each other generation in a certain circular progression. But since these never appear to be the same, who, without being covered with confusion, can confidently assert that any one of these is this rather than that? Certainly no one. Hence it will be far the most safe method of proceeding to speak about them as follows. That the nature which we always perceive becoming something different at different times, such, for instance, as fire, is not fire absolutely, but something fiery. And again, that the nature which we denominate water is not absolutely so, but such like, or watery. And that it is not at any time anything else, as if it possessed any stability of essence. And lastly, that they cannot be distinguished by any word, such as we are accustomed to employ when endeavoring to show that any particular is either this thing or that. For they fly away, incapable of sustaining the affirmation which asserts them to be this thing of such a nature belonging to this, and all such appellations as would evince them to be something permanent and real. Hence, we ought not to denominate any one of these either this or that, but something such like, and a perpetually revolving similitude. Thus, we should assert that fire is everywhere such like, and should speak in the same manner of everything endued with generation. But we should alone distinguish by the appellations of this or that the subject in which each of these appears to be generated, and again to suffer a dissolution. But this subject is by no means to be denominated such like, as for instance hot or white, or any quality belonging to contraries, or anything which contraries compose. However, let us endeavor to explain more clearly what we mean to express. For if anyone, fashioning all possible figures from gold, should without ceasing transform each figure into all, and if during this operation someone who is present should, pointing to one of these figures, inquire what it is, it might most safely, with respect to truth, be replied that it was gold. But he who should assert that it is a triangle, or any other of the figures which are continually generated, and which ought by no means to be denominated beings, would fall from the truth in the midst of his assertion. But we ought to be content with that answer as most safe which denominates it such like, or of such a determinate nature. In the same manner, we should speak concerning that nature which is the general receptacle of all bodies. For it never departs from its own proper power, but perpetually receives all things, and never contracts any form in any respect similar to any one of the intromitted forms. It lies indeed in subjection to the forming power of every nature, becoming agitated and figured through the supernally intromitted forms. And through these it exhibits a different appearance at different times. But the forms which enter and depart from this receptacle are the imitations of perpetually true beings, and are figured by them in a manner wonderful and difficult to describe, as we shall afterwards relate. At present, however, it is necessary to consider three sorts of things. One, that which is generated; another, that in which it is generated; and third, that from which the generated nature derives its similitude. But it is proper to assimilate that which receives to a mother, that from whence it receives to a father, and the nature situated between these to an offspring. It is likewise necessary to understand that the figured nature can never become distinguished with an all-possible variety of forms, unless its receptacle is well prepared for the purpose and is destitute of all those forms which it is about to receive. For if it were similar to any one of the supernally intromitted forms, when it received a nature contrary to that to which it is similar, or any form whatever, it would very imperfectly express its similitude, while at the same time it exhibited the very same appearance with the supernally exceeding form. And hence it is necessary that the receptacle which is destined to receive all possible forms should itself be destitute of every form. Just as those who are about to prepare sweet-smelling unguents so dispose a certain humid matter as the subject of the ensuing odor, that it may possess no peculiar smell of its own, and as those who wish to impress certain figures in a soft and yielding matter are careful that it may not appear impressed with any previous figure, but render it as much as possible exquisitely smooth. In the same manner, it is necessary that the subject, which is so often destined to receive in a beautiful manner, through the whole of itself, resemblances of eternal beings, should be naturally destitute of all that it receives. Hence, we should not denominate this mother and receptacle of that which is generated, visible, and every way sensible, either earth or air or fire or water, nor again any one of the composites from these, or anything from which these are generated, but we should call it a certain invisible species, and a formless universal recipient, which in the most dubious and scarcely explicable manner participates of an intelligible nature. Of itself, indeed, we cannot speak without deception, but so far as it is possible to apprehend its nature from what has been previously said, we may with greatest rectitude assert as follows: that fire appears to be its inflamed part, water its moist part, and that earth and air are its parts in a similar manner, so far as it receives the imitations of these. But we ought rather thus to inquire about these, distinguishing and separating them by a reasoning process. Whether there is a certain fire itself subsisting in itself, and whether this is the case with all such particulars which we perpetually assert to subsist from themselves, or whether such things alone as are the objects of sight and which are perceived through the ministry of the body possess being in truth. so that nothing besides these has in any respect any subsistence. That we in vain assert there is a certain intelligible form of each of these, and that all such forms are nothing but words. Indeed, whether such a doctrine is true or not must not be asserted rashly and without examination, nor is it proper to add to the present disputation, which is naturally prolix, anything tedious and foreign from the purpose. But if any definition can be employed in this affair, comprehending things of great moment in short compass, such a one will be very opportune to our present design. In this manner, then, I shall relate my opinion on the subject. If intellect and true opinion are two kinds of things, it is every way necessary that there should be forms subsisting by themselves, which are not the objects of sense, but which are apprehended by intelligence alone. But if, as appears to some, true opinion differs in no respect from intellect, everything which is perceived through body is to be considered as possessing the most certain and stable nature. But in reality, these ought to be denominated two distinct things, because they are generated separate from each other and are dissimilar. For the one of these subsists in us through learning, but the other through persuasion. And the one is indeed always attended with true reason, but the other is irrational. The one is not to be moved by persuasion. The other, on the contrary, is subject to this mutation. And lastly, of true opinion every man participates, but of intellect all the gods, and but a few of mankind. Such then being the case, we must confess that the form which subsists according to same is unbegotten and without decay, neither receiving anything into itself externally, nor itself proceeding into any other nature. That it is invisible and imperceptible by sense, and that this is the proper object of intellectual speculation. But the form which is synonymous and similar to this must be considered as sensible, generated, always in agitation, and generated in a certain place, from which it again recedes, hastening to dissolution, and which is apprehended by opinion in conjunction with sense. But the third nature is that of place, which never receives corruption, but affords a seat to all generated forms. This indeed is tangible without tangent perception, and is scarcely by a certain spurious reasoning the object of belief. Besides, when we attempt to behold this nature, we perceive nothing but the delusions of dreams, and assert that every being must necessarily be somewhere and be situated in a certain place. And we by no means think that anything can exist which is neither in the earth nor comprehended by the heavens. All these, and all such opinions as are the sisters of these, we are not able to separate from our cogitation of that which subsists about a vigilant and true nature. And this because we cannot rouse ourselves from this fallacious and dreaming energy, and perceive that in reality it is proper for an image to subsist in something different from itself. since that in which it is generated has no proper resemblance of its own, but perpetually exhibits the phantasm of something else, and can only participate of essence in a certain imperfect degree, or it would become in every respect a perfect non-entity. But to true being, true reason bears an assisting testimony through the accuracy of its decisions, affirming that as long as two things are different from each other, each can never become so situated in either as to produce at the same time one thing and two things essentially the same. This, then, is summarily my opinion, that prior to the generation of the universe, these three things subsisted in a triple respect, namely being, place, and generation. Prior to the generation of the universe, these three things subsisted in a triple respect, namely being, place, and generation. And that the nurse of generation, fiery and moist, receiving the forms of earth and air, and suffering such other passions as are attendants of these, appeared of an all various nature to the view. But because it was neither filled with similar powers, nor with such as are equally balanced, it possessed no part in equilibrium, but through the perfect inequality of its libration, it became agitated by these passions, and again through its motion gave agitation to these. But the parts in motion, being separated from each other, were impetuously hurried along in different directions, similar to the agitations and ventilations which take place in the operations of textorial instruments, and such as are employed in the purgation of corn. For in this case the dense and the heavy parts are borne along one way, and the rare and light are impelled into a different seat. In the same manner, these four natures, being agitated by their receptacle, tumultuously moving like the instrument of corn, such as were dissimilar became far separated from each other, and such as were similar became again amicably united. And hence they passed into different seats before the universe was from the mixture of these distributed into beautiful order. But at the same time they all subsisted irrationally and without the limitation of measure. But when the artificer began to adorn the universe, he first of all figured with forms and numbers, fire and earth, water and air, which possessed indeed certain traces of the true elements, but were in every respect so constituted as it becomes anything to be from which deity is absent. But we should always persevere in asserting that divinity rendered them as much as possible the most beautiful and the best, when they were in a state of existence opposite to such a condition. I shall now therefore endeavor to unfold to you the distribution and generation of these by a discourse unusual indeed, but to you who have trod in all the paths of erudition, through which demonstration is necessarily obtained, perspicuous and plain. In the first place, then, that fire and earth, water and air are bodies is perspicuous to everyone. But every species of body possesses profundity, and it is necessary that every depth should comprehend the nature of a plane. Again, the rectitude of the base of a plane is composed from triangles. But all triangles originate from two species, one of which possesses one right angle and the other two acute angles. And one of these contains one right angle distributed with equal sides, but in the other, unequal angles are distributed with unequal sides. Hence, proceeding according to assimilative reasons, conjoined with necessity, we shall establish a principle of this kind as the origin of fire and all other bodies. The supernal principles of these, indeed, are known to divinity and to the man who is in friendship with divinity. But it is necessary to relate by what means four most beautiful bodies were produced, dissimilar indeed to each other, but which are able from certain dissolutions into each other to become the sources of each other's generation. For if we are to accomplish this, we shall obtain the truth concerning the generation of earth and fire, and of those elements which are situated according to analogy between these. And then we shall not assent to anyone who should assert that there are visible bodies more beautiful than these, each of which subsists according to one kind. We must endeavor, therefore, to harmonize the four sorts of bodies excelling in beauty, and to evince by this means that we sufficiently comprehend the nature of these. Of the two triangles, indeed, the isosceles is allotted one nature, but the oblong or scalene is characterized by infinity. We ought therefore to choose the most beautiful among infinites if we wish to commence our investigation in a becoming manner. And if anyone shall assert that he has chosen something more beautiful for the composition of these, we shall suffer his opinion to prevail, considering him not as an enemy, but as a friend. Of many triangles, therefore, we shall establish one as most beautiful, neglecting the rest. I mean the equilateral, which is composed from three parts of a scalene triangle. To assign the reason of this would indeed require a prolix dissertation, but a pleasant reward will remain for him who, by a diligent investigation, finds this to be the case. We have therefore selected two triangles out of many, from which the body of fire and of the other elements is fabricated, one of which is isosceles, but the other is that which always has its longer side triply greater in power than the shorter. But that which we formerly asserted without sufficient security, it is now necessary more accurately to define. For it appeared to us, though improperly, that all these four natures were mutually generated from each other. But they are in reality generated from the triangles which we have just described. Three of them indeed from one triangle containing unequal sides, but the fourth alone is aptly composed from the isosceles triangle. All of them, therefore, are not able, by a dissolution into each other, to produce from many small things a mighty few, or the contrary. This indeed can be effected by three of them. For as all the three are naturally generated from one triangle, When the greater parts are dissolved, many small parts are composed from them, receiving figures accommodated to their natures. And again, when the many small parts being scattered according to triangles produce a number of one bulk, they complete one mighty species of a different kind. And thus much may suffice concerning their mutual generation. It now remains that we should speak concerning the quality of each of their kinds and relate from what concurring numbers they were collected together. The first species, indeed, is that which was composed from the fewest triangles, and is the element of that which has its longer side twice the length of the shorter side which it subtends. But two of these being mutually placed according to the diameter, and this happening thrice, the diameters and the shorter sides passing into the same as into a center, hence one equilateral triangle is produced from 6 triangles. But 4 equilateral triangles being composed according to 3 plane angles form one solid angle. And this, the most obtuse of all the plane angles from which it is composed. Hence, from 4 triangles of this kind, receiving their completion, the first solid species was constituted, distributive of the whole circumference into equal and similar parts. But the second was formed from the same triangles, but at the same time constituted according to 8 equilateral triangles, which produced one solid angle from 4 planes, so that the second body received its completion from the composition of 6 triangles of this kind, and the third arose from the conjunction of twice 60 elements and 12 solid angles, each of which having 20 equilateral bases is contained by 5 plane equilateral triangles. In this manner, then, the other elements generated these. But the isosceles triangle, being constituted according to 4 triangles, and collecting the right angles at the center and forming one equilateral quadrangle, generated the nature of the 4th element. But 6 such as these being conjoined produced 8 solid angles, each of which is harmonized together according to 3 plane right angles. Hence, the figure of the body thus composed is cubical, obtaining 6 plane quadrangular equilateral bases. There is also a certain 5th composition which divinity employed in the fabrication of the universe, and when he delineated those forms, the contemplation of which may justly lead someone to doubt whether it is proper to assert that the number of words is infinite or finite, though indeed to affirm that there are infinite worlds can only be the dogma of one who is ignorant about things in which it is highly proper to be skillful. But it may with much less absurdity be doubted whether there is in reality but one world, or whether there are 5. According to our opinion, indeed, which is founded on assimilative reasons, there is but one world, though someone, regarding in a certain respect other particulars, may be of a different opinion. But it is proper to dismiss any further speculations of this kind. Let us now therefore distribute the 4 sorts of things which we have generated into fire, earth, water, and air. And to earth indeed let us assign a cubical form, for earth is the most immovable of all these 4 kinds and the most plastic or adapted to formation of all corporeal natures. But it is in the most eminent degree necessary that this should be the case with that which possesses the most secure and stable bases. Among the triangles, indeed, established at the beginning, such as are equilateral possess firmer bases than such as contain unequal sides. And hence, among the plane figures composed from each, it will be found that the isosceles is necessarily more stable than the equilateral, and the square than the triangle, both when considered according to parts and to the whole. On this account, by distributing this figure to the earth, we shall preserve an assimilative reason. This will be the case too by assigning to water that figure which is more difficultly movable than the other three, to fire the most easily movable form, and to air that figure which possesses a middle nature. Besides this, we should assign the smallest body to fire, the greatest to water, and one of a middle kind to air. And again, the most acute body to fire, and second from this to air, and the third to water. But among all these, it is necessary that the body which possesses the fewest bases should be the most easily movable. For being every way the most acute, it becomes the most penetrating and incisive of all. It is likewise the most light, because composed from the fewest parts. But that which is second to this possesses these properties in a secondary respect, and that which ranks as the third in a third gradation. Hence, according to right and assimilative reason, the solid form of the pyramid is the element and seed of fire. But we must assign that form which is second according to generation to air, and that which is third to water. And it is necessary to consider all these such with respect to their smallness, that no one of the several sorts can be discerned by us on account of its parvitude, but that, when many of them are collected together, their bulks become the objects of our perception. And besides this, all these were accurately absolved and harmonized by the divinity, both as to their multitude, motions, and powers, in such a proportion as the willing and persuaded nature of necessity was able to receive. But among all those natures whose kinds we have above related, the following circumstances appear to take place. And first, with respect to earth. When earth meets with fire, becoming dissolved by its acuteness, it is borne along, and remains in this dissolved state either in fire or in the bulk of air, or in that of water, till its parts, associating themselves together and again becoming mutually harmonized, produce again a body of earth, for it can never pass into another form. But water, when it is distributed into parts by fire or air, when its parts become again collected, produces one body of fire, but two bodies of air. And the sections of air form from one dissolved part two bodies of fire. Again, when fire receives into itself either air or water or a certain earth, and being itself small is moved in many natures. And besides this, when through opposing, being vanquished by the agitated forms, it becomes broken in pieces, then two bodies of fire coalesce into one form of air. And when air becomes vanquished and separated into parts, then from 2 wholes and a half, 1 whole form of water is produced. But again, let us consider this matter as follows. When any one of the other forms, becoming invested by fire, is cut by the acuteness of its angles and sides, then, passing into the nature of fire, it suffers no further discerption. For no species is ever able to produce mutation or passivity or any kind of alteration in that which is similar and the same with itself. But as long as it passes into something else, and the more imbecile contends with the more powerful, it will not cease to be dissolved. Again, when the lesser are comprehended in the greater many, and the few, being lacerated, are extinguished, if they are willing to pass into the idea of the conquering nature, they cease to be extinguished, and air becomes generated from fire, and water from air. But if, when this transition is accomplished, the composite opposes any of the other species, the agitated parts will not cease to be dissolved till, on account of their dissoluble subsistence being every way impelled, they fly to their kindred nature, or being vanquished and becoming one from many, similar to their vanquisher, they abide with the victor in amicable conjunction. But in consequences of these passions, they all of them mutually change the receptacles which they once possessed. For the multitude of each kind is distinguished according to its proper place, through the motion of its recipient seat. But such as become dissimilar to each other are borne along through the agitation to the place of the natures to which they are similar. Such bodies, therefore, as are unmixed and the first, are generated from such causes as these. But that other genera are naturally inherent in these forms is owing to the composition of each element, which not only from the first produces a triangle, together with magnitude, but also such things as are greater and less, and this so many in number as there are different kinds in the forms themselves. And hence, these being mingled in themselves and with each other produce an infinite variety, which it is proper he should contemplate who is about to employ assimilative reasons in the investigation of nature. He therefore who does not apprehend in what manner and in conjunction with what particulars the motion and composition of these take place, will find many impediments in the remaining part of this disputation. And these indeed we have already partly discussed, but a part still remains for our investigation. Here will end the fourth part of our reading of Plato's Timaeus, translated by Thomas Taylor and read by William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy.